During my junior year of college, the students stayed in what is affectionately called the Croft. Every night we would hear noises like someone walking. Well, one evening, as I lay in bed reading a book, I distinctly heard the sound of the Croft door opening and closing. I then heard halting steps on the stairs. These were not subtle creaks, but obvious footsteps, so I assumed it was my friend or his girlfriend coming back. Then the steps began to sound closer and closer to my door, but I heard no voices and an unexpected chill crawled down my spine. I felt nervous, so I yelled, "Is that you, Dave?" The steps stopped outside my door, but again, no one spoke. I was starting to become terrified when I heard my friend and his girlfriend walking down the path outside, and I immediately stuck my head out my window and asked who was in the Croft. They replied that no one but me was in there. I jumped out my window, and the moment I was out, I heard the door to my room slam open and heard the whispered scream of rage. No one in the group ever believed me, but I asked the castle's cook about it, and she explained that there were 3 ghosts in the Croft. One little girl who liked to play pranks, one weeping woman, and one malicious man. I was at my friend's birthday party, which was a sleepover. Randomly at about 2 or 3 a.m., every single one of us just woke up. Like 6 people woke up in the span of like a minute. One girl asked, "Does anyone else feel like they're being watched? Or was it just me?" We all agreed that we felt it too, so everyone kind of looked around a bit. We were all tired and decided that it was probably nothing, so we decided to go back to sleep. As we were trying to fall back asleep, my friend jerked up and said in a panicked voice, "Did anyone else see that?" while pointing at one of the corners of our room. Clueless, we all watched for a minute. Suddenly we heard a loud bang outside, and for a split second what looked like a shadow of a tree flashed in the corner of the room through the window. We made fun of our friend who got scared by the shadow of the tree and brushed it off and slept through the night. A couple of days later, I was having a casual conversation with the friend who hosted the birthday party, and he mentioned that there was lightning that night. But the thing is, the tree was already cut down a few days earlier. Comment your own stories for a chance to be featured in one of my videos. I worked at a coffee shop, and it was 3 a.m. There is one old baker in the back who rarely interacts with me. Other than that, I'm alone. I was cleaning the counter when I swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was behind me. I turned, then looked down. A small child is standing there, a native little toddler with a faux hawk staring at me intensely. How did he get behind the counter? I didn't hear the door open or see him come through the counter. I scanned the storefront. No one. I yell for the baker in case he has a friend or something visiting that lost their kid. He comes over and, like me, does a double take at the kid and is baffled. The kid starts muttering incoherently. I get him a glass of water and a donut hole, and the baker runs out of the store to do a perimeter of the block. I called the non-emergency line and explained, "I have a little kid with no parents. I can't get any information from the boy since he was just mumbling." The police arrive. Baker comes back and says that he can't find anyone else in the streets. The police try to speak to the kid and also get nothing, so they take him away. They told me the little guy walked several kilometers from the nearest reservation in the dead of night to my store. He had got into his parents' medicine cabinet and just walked out of the house. My uncle and I were finishing up gathering firewood because it was getting dark. We were driving back at a dirt road, and I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me," and "Don't turn away," repeatedly. Then I heard it again, tap tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. The truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. A few months later, I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." My uncle and I were finishing up My grandparents' parents' house had an attic. I was around 12 years old and I was staying over one night. I went to go use the bathroom, and it was around 3 or 4 a.m. As I was about to go sit down and empty my bladder, I suddenly heard a noise coming from the attic. I just thought it was my imagination and brushed it off until my older brother, who was also staying over, said, "Hey Clay, do you hear that coming from the attic as well?" We both started freaking out, and so we woke our grandparents up. My granddad, who was a karate master, stormed up into the attic, but he didn't find anything. As he was coming down the stairs of the attic, all four of us heard breathing coming from one of the boxes up in the attic. My grandma started panicking and immediately thought that it was some homeless guy who broke into our attic and started living up there. So she called the police. They arrived and they searched the attic, but there was no one there. To this day, I still can't go to the bathroom at night. Comment your own stories for a chance to be. We bought this house we were living in at the time for super cheap because the previous owner had hung himself in the downstairs coat closet and it wasn't selling fast enough. I was around 13 at the time, and so we had a huge German Shepherd who was 7 at the time. This dog was a beast. He wasn't afraid of anything, ever, constantly following me to school and waiting for me to come home at the foot of our driveway. All around a great dog. Again, let me re-emphasize, this dog wasn't afraid of anything. One day, I walked down the stairs to see my dog staring at the closet, just staring. He was standing up, tail between his legs, not moving an inch, just staring at it. The door was open. Which was weird because people in my house are usually good about closing things up. I go over to Rodney, my dog, and try and see if there is something in the closet from where he is looking. Can't see anything, but the closet is super dark. I try and snap Rodney out of it, but he won't budge. He just keeps staring and staring. I had never seen my dog like this. The most horrifying part, Rodney's head is moving slightly from left to right, like he is following the movement of something hanging in the closet. When I was about 12, I had a lot of issues with night terrors and rarely slept a whole night through. One night, I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I sat down, half asleep and thinking of nothing but emptying my bladder and going back to bed when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a man standing by the other door to the bathroom staring at me, not moving. He was wearing a tattered gray jumpsuit, had a crutch, and little to no hair. I don't remember how I got down into the basement or where my parents slept, but suddenly there I was, hysterical. My dad finally went up and looked in the bathroom and kitchen. He saw nothing but allowed me to sleep on the couch down in the basement anyway. I tried sleeping, but I just couldn't get myself to doze off. I was just so paranoid. About an hour or so later, I heard the sliding door to the bathroom from my sister's room and limping footsteps. The next morning, my dad searched around and noticed that the fridge and pantry had been raided. We never caught the guy. My dad was a cop for 32 years. A call goes out for reported screaming. It's mid-January. My father and another office respond to find a known deranged individual who has a very long rap sheet and has been in and out of psychiatric care for years. He was sitting on the front porch holding a double-sided wood-splitting axe, and steam was coming up off the grass, and there were chunks lying all over the lawn. Upon interviewing the suspect, he admits that he and a friend were playing poker. The suspect was losing nearly every hand and came to the conclusion that his friend was a heint, which is Southern for ghost, and was cheating him. The suspect grabbed the axe. A few years ago, my dad police car because it's haint ghost and was cheating him. The suspect grabbed the axe, chased his friend outside, and hacked him into dozens of pieces, thus causing the warm blood to create steam on the grass. My dad tells the suspect that he needs to get in the police car because it's haint-proof. He said the suspect dropped the axe and sprinted to get in the back seat while thanking them for helping him. A few years ago, I was walking through the woods off the beaten track a bit, and I smelt this really overpowering sweet smell. Being nosy, I pulled back the undergrowth to have a look and found a dead body. The guy had clearly been there a while and wasn't looking great, all swollen and green and black with various runny bits. The local wildlife had also been dining well for a few days. I called the police, who told me to wait with the body until they arrived. Being in the middle of nowhere, it took a while for them to arrive and it got dark, and I was just sitting there in the dark with him for a long time. It turned out he had committed suicide. For a long time afterwards, I had dreams about him, and he would talk to me in not nice things, mainly about how he was angry I had disturbed his resting place, and he wanted me to kill myself. Probably just my imagination, but all pretty disturbing at the time. He still turns up in my dreams from time to time, and no doubt will be tonight after telling this story. I woke up in the middle of the night from a dream where I heard someone screaming bloody murder. So I sit up in my bed, and I'm just sitting there when all of a sudden, it's the same bloody murder scream as before. It's coming from my older sister's room, right down the hall. So I jump up out of bed and run to my door. As I'm almost to it, it slams shut in my face. I rip it open after pissing myself to see a dark, empty hallway. I flip on the light on the wall and it's empty. I ran into my sister's room and asked her what the hell she's screaming for, and she said that she woke up to her dog with its head up growling at the hallway through her open door. So she stares out into the hall for a minute when she sees something dark and big crawling down the hall on all fours toward my room. So she screams once and it stops and looks at her. She screams again, and that's when I hopped up. According to her, it ran towards my room and she heard my door slam. So my folks and I all go around searching the house for open doors, windows, whatever, and we don't find anything. I go out for walks very late at night fairly often, so I've seen a few things. I left the house around 1:30 a.m. and it started as a normal walk. I wandered around the town till about 2 a.m. when I decided to go home. I was walking back the route I had come when I noticed a black van down the street. I didn't really pay much attention to it though, at first. I did pay attention though when I saw it slowly drive by me for a second time. I wasn't entirely sure it was the same van though, so I just continued walking, but this time I kept an eye out. However, about 10 minutes later, the same damn black van came down the street again. This time I knew for sure because it didn't have license plates. Now I was fairly scared, so I picked my pace up a little bit. When the van came around again this time, it stopped in the middle of the road a few houses in front of me. I stopped, turned around, and booked it back in the other direction. I made a few turns onto different roads and then ran right into someone's yard. I waited behind their fence and the same van came down the street. I assumed that when they couldn't find me, they finally decided to book it. But I waited in that yard for about 20 minutes before I ran back to my house. I go out. I'm in a house living with my girlfriend and another couple. I'm watching TV at around 2 a.m. in the living room. My girlfriend and the other guy is asleep, and I assume the other girl is out in her study, which you had to go outside to get to, so the back door is unlocked. From my vantage point, you can see a portion of the kitchen, which is next to the back door. I hear the back door swing open. I assume it's my housemate and continue watching my TV show. About 15 minutes later, I happen to glance through the doorway into the kitchen, as I hadn't heard my housemate either leave the house again or wander through to the bedrooms. I saw what looked like a guy standing in the corner of the kitchen staring at me. He had a brown jacket on, dark eyes and dark hair, and was clutching a bottle of my Midori, shoulders slumped, staring at me. When he sees that, I've noticed him. He moves. I get up from the floor and chase him to the kitchen, but he's gone. I then carefully went out the back, but nobody was there. I even went out the front, but nope, nowhere to be found. I went as far as going in the driveway and down the street, but he just disappeared into thin air. Still gives me chills thinking about it. My brother told me, maybe 13 years ago, that one night when he was falling asleep, he heard a loud bang sound. Not like a gunshot, but more of something hitting the wall at a high speed. He opened his eyes to find me standing in the dark corner of his room. My eyes were glowing red, he said. All he really saw was my shadowy figure and these bright red eyes. He called to me asking, "What the hell?" Apparently, I didn't answer. He then continued, saying he turned his head to the clock near his bed and quickly looked back at the corner I was standing in and saw absolutely nothing. I was gone. What's even more terrifying is that he got up and went to his door. It was still locked. He opened it, walked down the hall to see my door still closed. He looked further down the hallway, only to see me standing in the middle of the hallway with my still glowing red eyes. He opened my door after seeing that, and that's when he became really frightened. There I was, laying passed out on my waterbed. To this day, he can't explain what or who he saw. After he told me all that, I have been seeing those red eyes throughout my life, but only in the dark parts of my house. My brother would get a call on his cell phone around 2 or 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it was this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after a month of this, and it stopped. Then, after a week or so, it began again. The exact same noise, same time. Finally, one day, he decided to back dial the call. It was an old man who had no clue what he was talking about. Still, the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times. No messages were left. He then decided to end his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. You guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time, he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening, he backdialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time, he lost his job and his phone. The calls stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day, my mom asked me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother, and he was freaking out. He backdialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected. This time. Never heard from it again after that. My brother would get a call on my uncle's house is out on a very eastern part of NY, which was said to be haunted due to the family that used to own it in the 1800s. They decided not to give it to the stableman and sold it instead. He and the maid were said to have haunted the place. We always used to joke that you would hear people or things moving at night, but since the house is so old, we used to just laugh it off. My uncle's friend had her and her sister stay over the house one night, and the friend noticed a maid bringing towels down the stairs when she woke. She saw the maid again, bringing what looked like a percolator down the stairs. She was so impressed by my uncle hiring staff since he was a neurologist in New York and had a habit of spending a lot. She went back to bed and woke up later downstairs to see my uncle and his friend just chatting. She asked where the maid went and she thought that the maid was cooking breakfast. My uncle had no idea what she was talking about and asked what she looked like. The sister explained and he laughed, walked her to the living room and pointed to an old picture. She said that was the woman. My uncle replied, "Yeah, she has been dead for about 100 years." My uncle's house. My dad died of cancer the day I turned 16 after about 2 weeks in a coma. Everything was so sudden and just out of the blue. It had only been less than 2 months between diagnosis and death. He died in the house because we had a hospice attendant and my mom was very good about seeing him in those final days. However, a lot of weird stuff happened after he passed, like weird noises coming out of different corners of the house, lights being turned on while we were out of the house. However, one thing that still freaks me out when I think about it happened about 12 hours before he took to bed for the last time. He was in our living room napping on the couch while my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner. No one else was home. Suddenly he jerked awake and was shouting for my mom in a very loud, agitated voice, clearly angry with her. "Beverly, don't do that. Don't ever do that again." She ran into the room, alarmed, and asked, "What are you talking about, George?" I was literally in the kitchen making dinner, and he said, "Don't do that. Don't walk past me like that in that long black wig." Sometimes I think he saw death. My dad died of cancer. Woke up. Clock says 3:34 a.m. I'm 17, and in my bedroom it's pitch black, but I hear some rattling downstairs. Terrified, I quietly tiptoed to my parents' room. Weird, it's empty. Where are my parents at 3:34 a.m.? Go upstairs to my brother's room. He's usually awake all night, but while the light is on, no one is in the room. So I guess whatever those noises are downstairs, it must be them. Why are they awake? Maybe someone died? I go downstairs. In the middle of my living room is what looks like 2 men stealing our TV. No one else is in sight. I run upstairs as quietly as possible, shut and lock my door. Suddenly, there's banging on the door. I wake up. It was a dream and the relief washes over me. I look over at the clock. Weird coincidence. It's 3:34 a.m. I'm shaking, but decide to go downstairs to prove to myself that everything's fine. I go downstairs. The 2 men are in my kitchen, screaming at my parents and brother. I run upstairs to my bedroom and lock the door. 10 seconds later, I heard banging. I woke up. It's 3:34 a.m. This time, I had actually woken up and I don't manage to fall back asleep for about 36 hours. Woke up. Clock says I woke up in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m. We had a 2-month-old newborn sleeping in the room next door. I had a video monitor on my bedside table so that my wife and I could easily check on him. So I clicked a button that turned on the video image, and what I saw scared me like nothing ever before. My baby boy was gone. Now I know that instincts should have made me run right into the baby's room. Instead, I froze. I looked over, and my wife was sleeping next to me. Finally, I moved, but not to run into the other room like I should have done. Instead, I turned up the volume on the baby monitor. I heard another woman's voice singing a lullaby. I'm not kidding. Another woman was singing to my baby in a very soft, gentle, and melodic voice. I don't remember what song it was, but they were saying, "Go to sleep, little baby." Finally, my freeze broke. I jumped up, ran through the hallway, and burst into my boy's room. He was sound asleep in his crib. No woman, no singing. Turns out the monitor was picking up my next-door neighbor's monitor. They had just bought the video monitor for their own newborn on our recommendation. My grandmother lives in an old house. On multiple occasions, I've seen a young boy running up and down the stairs of her house when there's no one else in the house. The creepiest experience with this was when I was house sitting for her. One night at about 3 a.m., I had woken up and went downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I never bothered to switch on any of the lights in the hallway and walked straight into the kitchen, where I did switch a light on. I poured myself a glass of water when all of a sudden I got a really horrible feeling of terror. I then began to hear the stairs start creaking, almost like someone walking down them. This terrified me as I knew there was no one else in the house. So, after a few minutes of freaking out and internally panicking, I mustered up the courage and walked out of the kitchen. As I looked at the stairs, I saw a smiling child's face staring directly at me. I froze in fear, and after a few seconds, it had completely disappeared. After seeing this, I turned all of the lights on in the house, watched TV, and never went to sleep that night. When I was about 12, my best friend and I rode our bikes and discovered this small hidden graveyard. It was backed by some railroad tracks and under big buzzing power lines far from any houses. There was barbed wire around the graveyard, and the tombstones were mainly faded, but we could see some of the dates from the late 1800s. We stopped and took pics for fun, but didn't think much of it. For about 2 years after that, I'd wake up every night around 3 a.m. because I'd hear papers rustling in my room. Then, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping once they reached the foot of my bed. I peeked a few times and didn't see anything. I started sleeping with the TV on to block it out. Eventually, I woke up one night because I heard what sounded like dozens of people whispering loudly in my ear, and so I screamed for my mom. I told my parents about it, and my religious mom threw holy water around the house. Then my dad bought flowers and told us to bring them to the graveyard. It stopped after that. I always thought that maybe I just had night terrors or something, or imagined it. I mentioned this to my dad again, and he said he'd also heard footsteps at night, but thought I was just getting some water or something at 3 a.m. When I was about 12, I turned 21 before my friends did, so naturally being an alcoholic, I went to bars alone. I was waiting in line one night, and an attractive woman who had clearly had too much to drink came up to me and started rubbing on my chest. I was a single man. I turned 21 before my friends did, so naturally being an alcoholic, I went to bars alone. I was waiting in line one night, and an attractive woman who had clearly had too much to drink came up to me and started rubbing on my chest. I was a single man, so if an attractive woman wanted to rub me, I was fine with that. She said how attractive I was, and then started saying how much she missed me, but we were total strangers. She started sobbing uncontrollably. By that time, her friends had caught up with her and saw her crying just before she turned and ran away from me. One of her friends chased after her, and the other walked up to me and said, "Sorry about that. Her boyfriend just died 2 weeks ago in a motorcycle accident." She was looking at me kind of funny. I said no problem, and that I was sorry for her loss. She said, "It's weird. Can I tell you something?" "Yes," I replied. "Oh my God, you look exactly like her boyfriend." Like exactly like her boyfriend. "We saw you as soon as she did. We froze and didn't know what to do when she ran up to you. We briefly exchanged pleasantries, and I went inside for a stiff drink. 3 months later, I was hit in a horrific motorcycle crash and nearly died." When I was a teenager, I was home alone one weekend, and I was sleeping in my parents' room since there was a TV in there. Sometime around 2 a.m., I felt like I was being stared at from the direction of the hallway. I looked up, and I saw a shadow person looking at me. It was weird because it was a pure man-shaped black mass, and I could see him in the dark hallway. I'm guessing light from the TV helped. I sat up and stared back, but I was terrified. We looked at each other for probably 5 seconds, and then it slowly turned and walked down the hall. A few seconds later, I heard a loud crash. I was so scared that I just turned the TV onto the Disney Channel and stayed awake for as long as possible. I still remember the rush of adrenaline I felt after that loud crash, and the dreading fear is still so vividly. When I woke up the next morning, with barely any recollection of what happened last night since I was half asleep, I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed a mirror that was hanging and fallen off the wall and was shattered. My family still doesn't believe me, but I know what happened. My high school girlfriend says she saw an old man in her house in the study. I laughed it off because I told her that her house was no older than 20 years old, and how could it be haunted? I jokingly said she saw a wooden carving her parents had that resembled Jesus because she described the man as having a big white beard. A few weeks later, I was walking from the stairs and into the kitchen where she was sitting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw an older man sitting at the head of the table in the dining room. I tell her but have to rule out my claim as the seed of belief may have been planted in my head. Months later, her friend from Brazil was visiting. My girlfriend and I were fooling around upstairs, and her friend burst through the door crying. In Portuguese, my girlfriend asks what's wrong, and her friend says she was listening to music with headphones walking around on the main floor when she ran into an old man with a white beard in the study. There was absolutely no way my girlfriend told her friend, as she wasn't a believer in the paranormal and didn't make a big deal about it when she told me. To this day, it is the one case in my life where I have to truly believe we all saw something in that house. My high school. One weekend, I was at my dad's house. He'd come to the upstairs bathroom to get a shave and heard footsteps in my stepsister's room. I thought it was him walking around initially, so I got up to find him standing at her closed door. He looked back at me and whispered, "You can hear that too, right?" I nodded and he opened the door slowly. My stepsister had been asleep and never been awake apparently. There was practically no way she had crossed the room, gotten in bed, and pretended to be that convincingly asleep in the 2 seconds it took my dad to open the door. He went in and checked her old 90s TV, which had never been on. Even the radio hadn't been on either. After that, we heard the footsteps a bunch of times. Usually very early in the morning, some of the footsteps were so heavy that they'd shake the ceiling fan of the dining room directly under her bedroom, and they'd woken her up a few times as well. Whenever I'd shower at my dad's, I always felt like someone was standing behind me. Eventually, I got so stressed and paranoid that I refused to shower at the house, or even go into the upstairs bathroom. My dad asked me one day, "Do you ever feel like someone's in the shower with you when you're here?" After months of feeling that way and never mentioning it to anyone. One weekend, when I was 7, I used to attend a camp. There was a counselor at the camp who was Russian. The other counselors said he was incredibly fast, and during staff-only campfires, he would catch, skin, and eat live rabbits. He could do this crazy sleeper hold move. It essentially was a strangling move that knocked you out for a few seconds, you came to, and were fine a minute later. I saw him do it on a counselor once. The guy was out for about 10 seconds. He was forbidden to do it after that. However, the kids got curious and started asking him to do the move. He would do it in secret, but he would increase the severity of his holds, which would, in turn, keep the kid knocked out for a longer period of time. One day, a camper went missing. He wasn't in his bunk, despite going to bed with his cabin that night. They did a camp-wide search, keeping us all on the soccer field for about 2 hours. The counselors had to start searching the water. They found his body under the sailing dock, completely out cold. He had strangle marks around his neck. Everyone knew who it was. They arrested the Russian guy and deported him back to Russia. Turns out they never even sent an exchange counselor. Nobody knew who he even was. When I was 7. When I was 13, I was spending the night at a friend's house. It was 3 in the morning, and some kind of alarm goes off inside his house. It wakes us both up, and we're freaking out. The reason we were freaking out is because he doesn't have any sort of alarm in his house but the smoke alarms, and this was definitely not a smoke alarm. I remember waking up in so much confusion that I could barely make it out if I was in a dream or not. He ran down to his parents' room, while I stayed upstairs in his bedroom, and I was waiting for him to come back for around 3 to 4 minutes and tell me what it was. When the alarm stops, it's dead quiet, no sound at all. Then I hear him walking back up the stairs, and he tiredly walks back in the room and drops dead asleep back into his bed. I frantically wake him up and ask him, "Hey George, what was that loud alarm about?" And he tiredly looks at me for a few moments and says, "What alarm?" And he falls back to sleep. To this day, he has no recollection of any of that happening, and neither do his parents. I was sleeping on my bed on a usual night when I suddenly hear footsteps outside my door and decided to peek out of my eyes to see what was happening. I saw my door swing open quietly to reveal a man who was about 6 feet 4 inches tall, carrying the corpses of my parents. This deranged-looking man had just murdered my parents in the room down the hall. After silently propping them up on a chair, he writes something on the wall in the blood of the dead bodies. He then tries hiding under my bed. I was scared beyond belief. My heart was pounding, and I felt as though he could have heard it pounding through my chest. I couldn't read the writing on the wall, and I knew the murderer was under my bed. And so the most logical thing I could have thought of at that moment was to just pretend that I was sleeping through the whole thing and I hadn't awoken yet. I lay still as the bodies, quietly hearing the breaths from under my bed. An hour passed, and my eyes started to adjust more and more to the darkness. I felt something shift under my bed, and I tried to make out the words, but it was a struggle. But when I finally heard it, "I know you're awake," I let out a huge gasp. I was sleeping. I was working security at a small company's headquarters. I just had to sit in the back room, watch some cameras, and occasionally head out for a sweep. Turns out, one of the employees had stayed in the building after hours and had managed to avoid my co-worker's sweep from the previous shift. I first noticed a movement in my peripheral vision on one of the screens. This was odd because I was used to quiet nights in this particular building. I had to start the sweep in one big hallway, and right as I entered, I saw a flash of movement at the end of it. I was sufficiently freaked out. I stood frozen for a minute or so, looking into the semi-darkness, unsure of what to do. The decision was taken out of my hands, however, as I heard a gunshot sound down the hallway. And on my left, I saw the president's office light was on. I creaked its door open and saw the man had taken a seat in the president's chair and shot himself in the head with a pistol, splattering blood and brains all over the floor and the wall. Apparently, this guy was having problems at home, and because the president was supposedly a total jerk to him, he decided to off himself and scare the crap out of the president at the same time. In any case, I threw up a few times and called the police. I was in bed asleep at 7 a.m. when I heard a loud bang. I thought nothing of it because of the large cat tree I have downstairs that's always getting knocked over, and tried to go back to sleep. Not long after, my elderly cat comes running into my bedroom, jumps up on the bed, and tries to hide under the blankets. This immediately woke me up. As I came, I saw 2 men coming up my stairs. At that point, it felt like time stopped and somehow ran incredibly fast at the same time. I jumped out of bed and started screaming, "Get out of my house!" while chasing them around my entire house. I tackled one of them on my front lawn, but he struggled free and got away. I saw the getaway car and tried to keep repeating the license number, but it faded away in my mind as I was repeating it. I remember vividly being so mad at myself that I couldn't remember 7 numbers, and how stupid I was for not grabbing my phone. Looking back on the situation, there are so many things that happened that I never noticed, like how I fractured my arm slamming into the wall at the bottom of my stairs, and that I cut my feet up on the splintered wood of my front door. The sense of time, not being aware of pain and injuries for hours. Luckily, I wasn't seriously hurt. I was in one morning at about 1 a.m. I got a phone call from my little sister's cell. She lived in a time zone to the east, so it was 2 a.m. there. It woke me up, and I immediately sensed that something was wrong. I picked up the phone and groggily said, "Hello?" when I heard a muffled woman's voice, possibly my sister's, say, "Please, help me." She sounded terrified and desperate. I immediately thought I was having a taken moment. My sister was being kidnapped, tortured, and it was all she could do to call me for help. Should I hang up and dial 911? Should I yell into the phone? Should I keep listening and try to pick up some kind of relevant information? I opted to keep listening, and as I did, I occasionally heard muffled yelling and screaming, much to my horror. Her phone must have been hidden away pretty well. Then something strange happened. I heard what was clearly my sister's voice, also muffled, but completely calm. I didn't hear what she said, but it was a very casual, conversational tone. Then I noticed for the first time that there was also scary music along with the yelling and stuff in the background. My sister butt dialed me in the middle of a goddamn horror flick at 2 in the morning. It was late at night on a campfire, and I was with some friends, and we were all telling some stories. One of the guys told us a story about a girl he knew. She was called over to babysit. She was told to put the kids to bed at 9, and she did. After she put them to bed, she started watching TV and doing homework, waiting for the parents to come home. But then, she started hearing some noises coming out of the basement, like pans falling and stuff. She just ignored it and thought it was the washing machine or something. Anyways, a little later, she starts hearing the noises again. She decides to call the police and tell them she is hearing noises coming out of the basement at the house she's babysitting at. The lady at the station told her there's a patroller in her area and that he'll be at the house in about 20 minutes. Anyways, in about 5 minutes, she hears a knock on the door. She answers, and it's a full SWAT team. She asks, "I thought they were just sending a patroller," and one of the guys told her, "After you hung up the phone, we heard a second phone on the line hang up. Ended up there was a man in the basement listening to the conversation. The lady in the station waited and heard him hang up, then immediately sent the SWAT team to help. They went downstairs and caught him. He was wanted for multiple cases of rape. It was late at night. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noises coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen, but could not make out what was being said. I approached the room, and she stopped talking. Thinking I alarmed her, I went into the room. At the time, she was sharing it with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw the 4-year-old sitting up in bed. I smiled and said, "Is everything okay?" She said, "Yeah, but her sister said they were keeping her up." I asked who. My 4-year-old said, sorry that she was talking. When I asked her who she was talking to, "The girl in the window, she said you were coming." My heart skipped a beat. I asked who the girl was, and they both said, "A girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them." Not knowing what to say, I said okay and tucked them in. The next day, I asked about the girl, and they said she came back, but was mad. I forgot about it for about a week. When my wife said, "Who are the girls talking to upstairs?" I freaked out, ran upstairs, and saw both girls sitting under the window looking up. They turned and looked at me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl. When they turned around, disappointed, they said the girl left. It has been about 5 years since, and I have not heard about the girl in the window since then. I'm a 911 dispatcher. One night I got a call from this lady at a residence. 911, what is your emergency? Is this the police? She breathed. She was freaking out. Heavy breathing. Scared, shaking voice. I've taken many calls like this, and from the sound of her voice, this was not going to be a routine call. There's someone in my house. She trailed off, very breathy and genuine. I dispatched the cars to start heading over to the address, and I don't give a reason yet. Do you know who this person is? Well, I know this sounds so crazy. I think that there's a ghost in my house. She begins to sob and sounds so scared. There are noises and I can hear them right now. The sergeant asks me the reason for the call and why they were dispatched. Normally, you'd send one car to something like that. It's suspicious activity, I told him. What activity? Sir, the caller believes there's a ghost in her house. 10-4 is all he said. By the time they got there, the ghost was gone and she kept apologizing for calling us, but it was real. She kept repeating. The officers later told me that her sincerity actually freaked them out a lot, and when they searched the house, guns drawn, even they were scared. I'm a My grandmother's entire life, she had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long, dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Dad?" No response. He turns on the bedside light. "Dad!" he says, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his father. He doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma worriedly opens the door and my dad shouts, "Something's wrong with Dad." He leads her down the hallway, a long hallway, to the last door on the left. My grandmother reaches the door, turns to the left, and sees her husband dead in bed. He had a heart attack, and she never had the dream after that again. My grandmother's I was home alone and I got a knock on the front door. I'm always cautious of people at the front door because my front door is set back on the side of my house out of view. 2 large security-looking men in big black suits and greasy hair stand over my door. They asked as they peered around me, "Do you live here alone?" I pretended I had a husband or something and said no. Then they asked, "Does your dog bite?" and "Is my house secure?" Then I asked where they were from again, and with one last look around me through to the house, they said, "We will come back later. Maybe you will be more cooperative." Now it doesn't sound scary, but home alone at 23 still freaked me out. I immediately went to the neighbors thinking they had spoken to these men as well. My neighbor said no, she hadn't, but she assumed they were friends of mine as their car was in my driveway almost every day this week. I called the cops and felt sort of silly, but wanted them to know that if I turned up dead, I know who did it. They took it very seriously, and after a squad car was sent out, I got a call later that evening and they said men matching the description were persons interested in a break and entry rate near where I lived. They sent a car out to see me and did regular checks for the next 3 nights. When I was 15, my stepfather got stabbed right in front of me. There was an altercation in the middle of our street at 2 in the morning that woke our whole house up. My stepfather and my uncle were still up drinking and went outside to see what was going on. There was a young man kicking the shit out of one of our older neighbors, an alcoholic gentleman who lived a few houses down from us. My stepfather and uncle went out to break it up, and in the commotion, my stepfather was stabbed by the guy. He stumbled back onto the porch and fell, and I tried to catch him. His blood smeared down the front of my shirt. The younger guy took off and we called 911. We were in the hospital until the early morning. When me and my mom got home, there was a message on our answering machine. It was a friend of mine from school crying and apologizing for calling in the middle of the night, but she had just had a dream that there was screaming and a fight and I was covered in blood. She begged me to call her back. The timestamp on the message was the same time as the stabbing. This is in the late 80s, before computers and even cell phones. I lived on the other side of town from her. There was no way she could have known what had happened. When I was 15, my grandmother was babysitting my sister because me and my parents were out of town. When we got back, my grandmother told my folks that 2 guys had come by the house with photography equipment and asked whether a young girl with red curly hair lived there and that they had spotted her and that she would be a great child model for some advertising work they were doing. When my grandmother said she wasn't home, they said they would come back another time. My grandmother and mom didn't think much about it, but my dad said, "Something's not right here," and called the police. 30 minutes later, several FBI agents showed up and began conducting interviews with my grandmother and my parents. Turns out we had been targeted by a child theft ring. The photographers would take a bunch of photos and wait until the toddler threw a tantrum, and the photographers would then ask the mother to go grab a toy to keep the child entertained. While the mother was out of the room, they would grab the child and bolt, leaving everything else behind. The FBI told my folks that my sister had already been sold and would have been out of the country within 24 hours if they got her. We were advised to change preschools and other aspects of our daily routine. I was in a store picking up groceries when I noticed a man was literally peeking at me from around a corner. I first brushed it off and continued my shopping, but was aware that this man was following me around the store. He then sang out to me and said I looked familiar and asked if I went to the local university. I didn't, so I said no. At this point, I got really creeped out, so I checked out of the store and went to my car. As I was walking outside of the store, I heard footsteps behind me and knew he had followed me, so I just jumped in my car and locked the doors. It was dark, so I hadn't noticed him go around the back of my car until he banged on my passenger window. I ignored him and started the car. This prompted him to run around the front and start banging on my driver's side door, trying to open it and asking me for a ride. I was terrified and just pulled out of the parking space as fast as I could and drove off, with him chasing my car for what felt like a solid minute until I rounded a corner. I have no idea what his plan was, but to this day, I am still nervous about dark parking lots at night. Subscribe I was driving with my friend through a park in our city when we came to a dead-end parking lot trying to find a certain trail. We started to turn around when a man who was in the trunk of his car ran up to the passenger side of my car, panicking and throwing his arms up. I immediately think he's broken down or needs help, or maybe something is wrong with my car. I locked the doors and rolled the window down a crack to hear what the issue was. When he came closer, I got a very uneasy feeling. The guy just didn't seem right. He smiled and asked if we had ever been to some store in the local area. He offered us candy and told us to take a look at what we wanted in the back of his car. What a cliche. Keep in mind, I was 21 or so at the time, not a child. At that point, I was accelerating to get the hell out of there, and as we were pulling away, another man was coming down the hill with a huge stick in his hand and immediately tried to flag us down too. I sped off and saw them talking together and watched as I drove away. On the road out, we saw a woman jogging towards where we had just had this super creepy encounter, and I pulled over immediately and told her to turn around. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I had just let her jog into that situation. I'm a paramedic and had just put a car accident victim in a body bag with a decapitation from driving under a truck's rear trailer. The coroner gave us the okay to load him up. He was wearing a heavy jacket and sweater, so we just stuck him in the bag and began to load him. After we got underway to the morgue, I heard a noise and the guy was thrashing around in the body bag violently. I was out of my mind. This guy had 90% of his head missing. We pulled over and my partner, who didn't see it, goes back over to the body and slowly starts opening up the bag while I was about to piss myself. What we saw next, I have never experienced in 32 years in EMS, and I've never had anything like that happen to me. The bag opens up and we saw the same drenched body in the bag, lying still. My partner and I were both confused, and then all of a sudden a very small chihuahua jumped out and ran up to my partner. Turns out he must have been in the guy's jacket pocket and been knocked out, or just quiet until we got underway. I'm a paramedic, and I worked for U-Haul, which was known to be in front of a sketchy club. So one day, I came in to open in the morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I heard frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I opened the door, and I saw there's a woman completely naked, covered in what looked like blood. I called the cops, grabbed one of the moving blankets, and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. It turns out it ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. And then later I found out she was drugged at the club that night, early morning, raped, and left blacked out in the alley. I still remember the look of terror on her face. I worked for my friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled them. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters or 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply, but he suddenly dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head when it severed his spinal cord. My friend, this event caused my mom to have such severe panic attacks that she had to return and live with her parents for 6 months. My mom's first husband was a Navy pilot during the Gulf War. The carrier was about 10 days into its cruise. She hadn't heard anything from the ship since it left, but that was to be expected. About 10 days into the cruise, my mom woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. She saw her husband standing in the room. It wasn't an ethereal form either. He appeared solid and utterly the same. The only thing different about him was that his head was shaved. He only had one thing to say: goodbye. This whole experience startled my mom, and she couldn't get back to sleep. She went to the kitchen to get some water when the doorbell rang. All military wives know what the late-night doorbell means. Her husband had suffered a massive heart attack and died aboard the carrier. She was grief-ridden, but reasoned that the apparition had been a hallucination born of the stress of having a spouse deployed. Her mother and mother-in-law flew out immediately to plan for the funeral and receive the body, only to find out her lifeless husband was bald. In a letter from his NFO, the shaved head was explained as the result of a lost bet. This of Tarare, a Frenchman in the 1700s who could not stop eating. He was said to have an incredibly large mouth with stained teeth. His parents kicked him out as a teenager because he was literally eating them out of the house and home. He ate any and everything, including live animals, stones, silverware, anything he could get his hands on, and supposedly had a visible vapor rising off of his body. The French military even tried employing him as a courier to smuggle documents by eating them. No doctor was able to find a cause or a cure for his appetite. He was eventually kicked out of the military hospital where they were studying him after falling under suspicion of eating a 14-month-old child that went missing from the same hospital. A reasonable suspicion, since they caught him trying to eat dead bodies in the morgue on several occasions. Harare. I was just crying and in my room alone when someone or something invisible answered my whispered cry for help. I was about 17 and was in my bedroom crying my eyes out over something. Home could be difficult at times, and that evening I was really upset. I really needed someone to talk to, but the only phone in the house was downstairs where my parents were, so calling a friend wasn't an option. I didn't know what to do to deal with the crap I was trying to live with, and really felt that it couldn't go on for much longer. I remember thinking, please, someone, just help me. Not a prayer as such. Rather, it was more sort of a mental scream into the void. There was definitely no one in the room with me. It was a tiny room, and I had my back to a chest of drawers. And then I felt something on my left shoulder, as if someone was standing behind me and resting their hand on me. I could feel the weight of each individual finger and the palm cupping my shoulder, and I could feel warmth from it. It didn't scare me, but it was enough to stop me from crying. I guess the feeling lasted for a minute or so and then just stopped. I have no idea what it was, but it was enough to calm me down. I wish I could feel it again. This night shift incident still sends chills down my spine even after almost 4 years whenever I mention it to someone. I work the night shift at a rehab facility. We have a protected gate with a camera looking down from above and one of those doorbell cameras. In the office, the camera monitor is on one wall and the doorbell monitor is on another. I was doing some paperwork and saw this guy walk past, stop for a few seconds, then slowly turn around, walk back, and stare at the camera. And he kept staring. The facility is in a rough neighborhood, so I'm fairly used to folks hanging out around the gate and usually ignore it, but the way he was staring was off-putting. Like, his eyes and expression were hollow and dead, almost as if he were in deep thought about something horrible. I used the intercom to see if he was okay, but he just kept staring directly at the camera. We have a rule. If it's not hurt or trying to come through the fence, just let it be. But believe me when I say he stood there and stared at that camera for 2 whole hours. That same dead-eyed expression stared right at me. I did a round and came back to find him gone, which only creeped me out more. This night, I was upstairs in my room one night playing video games with the volume loud when I thought I heard noises coming from downstairs. I muted the TV and listened closer. Nothing. But after an hour, I heard it again, only louder. I was sure I heard it this time and was a little freaked out. I went downstairs to the basement where I thought I heard the noise coming from. As soon as I opened the basement door, I was hit with a cold breeze. I went downstairs and saw the window wide open. I was sure I had closed and locked all the windows in the house. I was ready to make a run for it when something stopped me. I turned around and for the first time noticed the closet door was slightly cracked open. I stood for what seemed like 30 minutes in front of that door debating whether I should open it. All of a sudden, I heard a creepy crackle coming from inside the closet. I ran up the stairs as fast as ever, locked the door, and called the cops. They came in, and not even 5 minutes later, I heard a gunshot. They came out with a deranged-looking man, probably homeless. They put him in the back of the car and told me they had opened the door and the man was holding a gun at them, but he luckily missed, and the cops disarmed and arrested him. I was so close to being murdered. I was upstairs. In 1995, a cop pulled me over, and I called 911 to get out of going to jail as I was running late to work in my car. I didn't come to a complete stop on a right turn, and I saw lights behind me, so I pulled over. I barely had any gas at all, and I was near a gas station, which is the reason why I didn't stop at the turn, trying not to have the car die. As I gave the cop my license, registration, and insurance card, I got an idea. I knew that I was going to get arrested, booked, and released because I was driving with a suspended license for unpaid traffic tickets, and I had a bench warrant for it. They were super strict there. At the time, which is around 1995, a new digital phone had come out called Voice Steam, and their whole big thing was that the phones were digital and untraceable. So I got an idea, and right after I handed the papers to the cop, and as he was walking back to his car, I called 911 and told the operator I just saw a guy with a shotgun walk into a 7-Eleven that was about 2 blocks away. About 30 seconds later, the cop comes sprinting to my car and hands me all my stuff. He quickly says, "Come to complete stop next time," then drives off in the direction of the store. My wife of 7 years wore a red ribbon on her wrist. When I found out why, it shocked me to my core. I have a wonderful wife who's 32 years old. We have been married for 7 years and have 3 beautiful children who gave me shivers of excitement down my spine when they were born. Ever since our last date night, I wonder sometimes why she wore it. The day I found out why she did was the day I almost hung myself out of confusion. "Honey, you're back from work," she said, with a slight grin on her face whilst tightening the ribbon around her wrist. "Hi, babe. The office was a bit crowded today, so my boss let me come home early." As I replied, a disgusting stench drafted into my nostrils. I immediately gagged, wondering what the hell the smell was, and noticed it came from the direction in which my wife sat. "Babe, what is that smell?" I say, pinching my nose in disgust. "Oh, nothing," she said a few moments later. I looked at the red ribbon and noticed it was a bit stained, so without warning, I just pulled it off. Beneath the ribbon was the most vile thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. There, underneath the ribbon, were bits of torn flesh, rotting as maggots swarmed her hand. I instantly shrieked and ran out of the room, barfing in the bathroom. My wife of I was walking with a coworker on a break just to stretch our legs. Near the top of some stairs, we were in mid-conversation while heading down, and all of a sudden I heard him go, "Oh God," and trip and fall somehow. He rolled down and landed at the bottom in a heap, face first in the concrete. I just stared for a few seconds because it was so sudden. I ran to the bottom while asking if he was okay, but he didn't move or respond. I got close and realized there was blood coming from his head, and his face, arms, and legs were seized up and stiff when I tried to roll him over. I freaked out, but managed to call 911, and they told me to roll him over and do CPR while they came. The ambulance got there about 7 minutes after I called and took him to the hospital, but I'm 99% sure he was already dead when I was doing CPR. I will get flashes where I realize what happened and feel an intense tightness in my chest. It's also just really sad because he was one of my best friends at work. I've barely slept for the last 5 days and was full of adrenaline for a full day after it happened. He was single with no kids or anything, only has a brother and father who live in other states.